Have you ever experienced playing through a quest in Genshin Impact and thought to yourself, this interaction here looks quite gay? Well, with how frequently this happens, you might be under the impression that unlike the real world, Teyvat is seemingly a utopia where all queer people can thrive without risking discrimination. But is that truly the case, or is it possible that Teyvat might not be as progressive as the fandom would make it out to be? Well, that's why I'm here to attempt to analyze Teyvat's cultural attitudes towards queer people using various pieces of evidence so that we can finally find out whether our favorite gay couples will be allowed to get married without someone throwing tomatoes at them. On the surface, it can be a bit tricky to find out if homophobia is a cause of concern, since if queerness can't be explicitly stated in the game's content due to there being censorship, the game can't also depict homophobia explicitly either, but that doesn't mean that we can't look for hints and signs. There are in fact a couple of scenes that come to mind that I think might be more obvious hints towards homophobia, but aside from just talking about those, I'm also going to examine cases of sexism or other gender discrimination in Teyvat to estimate the likely cultural perception of gay people, since a society that belittles women is probably going to be far from accepting gender and sexual minorities. Of course, queer people can also be misogynistic, but in general, treatment of women and treatment of queer people are likely to go hand in hand. So with that said, is there sexism in Teyvat? Man, imagine having to answer a tricky question by posing another tricky question, but I will say this one is slightly easier to answer because of some easy bits of proof that we can look into. For one, it's quite obvious that women don't seem to face glass ceilings in their careers, meaning that they can advance to high positions in practically any field, even those that may be considered more masculine in the real world. Women are not barred from being high-ranking government officials, captains, generals, academics, and other sorts of jobs that are still mostly held by men in the real world. There are also women who are revered for their immense power, such as the Hexen Circle, consisting of witches with talents that can transcend some of Teyvat's rules, and as well as female gods who do make up the majority of gods, making it difficult for society to deny women's status as equals to men. However, if you paid close attention to some details within the lore, your bubble has probably been burst. I think for me, one of the most notable quote-unquote bubble bursting moments in the game was probably playing Ayato's story quest, where we find out that yes, even female clan rulers can risk losing their positions upon marriage, because apparently even in Teyvat, where women are allowed to become anything as if it were Barbie land, at the end of the day, they still have to marry into their husbands' families, risking the career opportunities they have currently. Sounds a lot like real life, huh? In addition to that, Thomas Hangout also revealed that housekeeping is still mostly left to women. And it's not just that the women did housework willingly because it was their strong suit, but they did it out of social expectations while their husbands slacked off at home as they got home from work. They even asked Toma if his housekeeping classes were open to men, indicating that there is a social expectation that women do all the housework and men doing housework is almost unthinkable within families. But they're probably allowed to do housework as part of a job like Toma does. That reveals that gender roles still exist to some degree in Teyvat, so it can be difficult for some citizens to break free from heteronormative expectations, at least within relationships. So it might be possible that a gay couple would be asked, who's the man and who's the woman among them? I doubt that this is just part of Inazuman culture, as women have notably faced gender-based violence throughout history and even in the current timeline, in cases involving the maidens in Ludi Harpastum a millennium ago. There's also the case of Makhaira, the wielder of the 4-star Sumeru Claymore, and even Lynette. If the ability to oppress women in such a way remains, then of course queer and trans women may be oppressed by some evil forces as well, so these cases are not very reassuring at all. Hence, following those patterns, it may be the case that women and by extension, possibly queer people, can have fulfilling careers without any barriers, but gender role expectations may arise from others who want to dictate how their relationships should go. Although these cases may not be perfectly comparable, and of course, queer men and women face different struggles, so don't take this conjecture too seriously. But suffice to say, Teyvat is not a complete utopia for gender equality. Regardless, it's also worth examining Teyvat's unique attitudes towards gender expression, as there seems to be many characters who don't present themselves as strictly masculine or strictly feminine, and this can be a good sign that gender minorities are accepted to a certain degree in Teyvat society. This will give us an insight into the gender part of queerphobia too. You have characters like Venti, Xingqiu, and especially Linne, who has gained notoriety in the homophobic section of the Korean fanbase because he looks gay to them. As for the women, our choices are narrower with mostly just Arlecchino and Furina, but hopefully those instances will expand more in the future. Anyway, if incels on the internet can be seething at the sight of a pretty magician with a bow behind his back, while Fontainians are such huge fans of him, that shows that Teyvat is way too progressive for real-life players to handle, right? Well, it may be slightly more complicated than that, since we don't know how citizens of Teyvat assign gender to clothing. For instance, do they view high heels as masculine, feminine, or unisex? A concrete example would be Neuvillette, who sports a bow in his hair, as well as high heels with blue velvet soles. To some of us, we might construe Neuvillette's appearance as feminine, but his fashion was sort of typical for men who had a high status during the 18th or 19th century, so Fontainians might still view him as a sort of masculine figure. I personally do enjoy viewing Neuvillette as sort of non-binary, I guess, but I'm just saying his clothes may not necessarily depict gender fluidity by default in the Teyvat setting. I've seen some people try to make comparisons to the clothing of NPCs, but I don't find that to be such a reliable metric, considering NPCs are designed to look more dull on purpose, so it's hard to say for sure. However, Teyvat is also not fully removed from real life. Like, the designers probably invoked some gender norms for clothing that are based on our real-life view of gender, considering that character designs are also made to fit our audience perceptions. So if we hold those complications aside and assume that in Teyvat, Venti's Archon form and his statue appear feminine, and that Linne's fashion is feminine, the fact that people are fans of these figures means that people don't really mind alternative forms of gender expression. A more concrete example of social acceptance of androgyny in gender expression would be the fact that Arlecchino is called father, and none of the children of the House of the Hearth nor other bystanders seem to mind this, indicating that they're not strict with enforcing cisgender identification. With this said, this openness can point towards the idea that society may be more accepting of gay relationships, because even though gender and sexuality are different, attitudes towards them are often intertwined. I know this contradicts some points from the previous section, but we'll try to synthesize all of these later. Another factor that points to the idea of Teyvat citizens being more accepting of queer people compared to real life is the fact that religion in Genshin's world building is far different. Not only are the gods known to exist for sure and have their deeds documented throughout history, they also are kinda queer themselves. We already mentioned Venti earlier, then aside from that, Zhongli seems to like old woman perfume, A seems to like her fox a little too much, and fans have noticed that Furina's clothes are quite princely in nature. It's hard to tell if their constituents have put two and two together regarding these details, but what's for sure is that these gods don't seem interested in enforcing gender roles strictly themselves, as they're more focused on the ideals that matter to them. Venti especially would be more inclined to encourage freedom in entering all kinds of relationships rather than creating all these strict rules. Even if his church is strict, it doesn't seek to dictate Mondstadt's citizens in the way the real-life Catholic Church has done throughout history. And as for the other gods, they don't seem to have well-defined religious authorities dedicated to them. Hence, people in Teyvat are not likely to use religion as a defense for their homophobia, or many of them may not be homophobic to begin with because there's no authority that teaches them that queer people are acting immorally. So that's something to consider as well. However, queer phobia may still persist in a society that values procreation too much to an unhealthy degree. Parents might freak out if their children fall in love with someone of the same gender, or if their children are aromantic, asexual, and don't want to marry, thus barring them from having grandchildren in the future. So let's examine if that's a thing that occurs in Teyvat. Again, I think the game chooses not to depict such a thing because many of its players are probably single and aren't thinking of marriage yet, so they likely don't want to hear pressuring messages like that from a game they're playing. That explains why even clan rulers like Ayato, Ayaka, Kokomi, Diluc, and some others I may have missed don't really discuss the pressure they face to find a suitable partner by a certain age. In fact, in Diluc's own character story, some Mondstadters joke that he should stay married to the winery instead, meaning that on the surface they don't mind the idea of him completely devoting himself to his career instead of finding a partner. And my ROA self is thoroughly pleased by this. However, it is also just a joke, and more genuine pressure for him to marry might arise more once he enters his 30s, so he's not safe yet. In Ningguang's case, she's said to have many male suitors, but she doesn't really accept their affections, and fans may interpret this as a hint to her potential lesbianism. Regardless, what we do know is that people become curious about her rejection to these suitors, so I guess that can still be a hint at people making heterosexual courtships a big deal, that when someone acts unexpectedly, they become really confused. Of course, I don't think people necessarily talk about it negatively, but I do think their surprise indicates that most people expect that heterosexuality is the default. Another interesting thing about Teyvat is that it doesn't seem like attitudes towards gender and sexuality are starkly different between generations. In real life, some civil rights and some breakthroughs in gender equality have only been reached within our grandparents' lifetimes, and same-sex marriage still isn't legal in many countries, so the way older people think about these issues differs a lot from the youth. However, in Teyvat, it seems like women had good career opportunities and were well regarded even millennia ago, especially with some gods taking on female forms, as I said. So chances are the playable character's grandparents probably have the same ideas on gender and sexuality as this generation of playable characters. I don't think that's completely positive either, in the sense that compared to having very liberal young generation and a conservative older generation, both generations might be somewhere in between regarding their perception of queerness, so there's still a lot for them to learn. Or it could be the case that opinions on queerness vary even within the same generation. And there are also some interesting nuances, like for instance, it may be possible that some parents in Teyvat are okay with other kids being gay but freak out when it comes to their own kids, as that may ruin their chances of preserving the bloodline. But again, this is all just conjecture. So all of those previous examples were tangentially related to gay people, but not actual examples of societal acceptance or disapproval for same-gender attraction specifically. However, I do have a few examples which may be more concrete. For instance, regardless of which traveler you choose, some NPCs might make some side comments shipping you with certain playable characters. Like, Tsuyuko said it looked like you were on a date with Kokomi regardless of whether you chose Lumine or Aether. On the flip side, there's also the case of Jet, who has been construed by fans to be lesbian, considering her distinctly more affectionate feelings towards Lumine rather than Aether. Upon Azaric teasing her for hanging out more often with girls. Jet seemed to be nervous at the insinuation and had two different responses depending on your chosen traveler, which were either, "And so what, do you have a problem with that?" or hey, quit it, stop giving them the wrong idea." In the first option, she's more confident but still defensive, wondering if Azarik is probably attacking her underhandedly for her preferences, while in the second one, she herself is nervous and seems to want to hide her attraction to women. Both of these responses kinda hint towards her not feeling 100% safe in declaring she's queer in case she receives bad comments about it, and I believe that this is probably the most blatant example of homophobia I've seen in the game. If you found lots of the examples and analysis I discussed to be quite contradictory, don't worry, I think that's the point. I think that across all these examples, an important factor to consider might be privilege. I mean it in the sense that powerful people in Teyvat might be less likely to be targeted by homophobia if the public both fears and respects them to the point that they won't criticize their private matters openly. Meanwhile, if there are figures in Teyvat that the majority want to ostracize, they can probably leverage their quote-unquote deviant sexuality or gender expression to do so. It's like stacking up a case against them or something. It is possible that Teyvat citizens will hate a queer person for other reasons, but also add their queerness as a cherry on top of their cake of hatred. When it comes to queer phobia in particular, I will clarify that it's not always the case that privilege comes with status. There are some characters who are in positions of power that invite more scrutiny from the general public or from their family members, so they are still at risk of facing queer phobia if they don't adhere to social expectations. Meanwhile, there are some, let's say, financially challenged characters who are able to do whatever they want because no one has a personal stake in their lifestyle. Let's say when it comes to Venti, for instance, he's broke and he's kind of famous as well, but people probably won't care if the local bard is queer because that's just not the kind of relationship they have with him. Lots of the characters we meet in-game have that sort of privilege. They hold a great amount of influence over other citizens of their respective countries, and the fact that they have visions is also a testament to them standing out and carving out their own path for themselves, allowing them to transcend social expectations from the get-go. Because of that, generally speaking, they are more likely to be insulated from queer phobia. However, NPCs might be more subject to it if they feel the pressure to follow social expectations to maintain a stable life, especially if there are some sections of society where women don't gain access to relevant job opportunities, then the pressure to marry will be even stronger for them. And regardless of privilege, evidence still points to the default expectation being heteronormative, so Teyvat still seems like the type of place where if you don't come out, people will probably still assume you're straight. So with all that said, does homophobia and queer phobia in general exist or not in Teyvat? Well, I don't think I can answer it for certain, but my idea is that it does exist, but generally much less than in real life. It is possible for queer people to have fulfilling careers without facing barriers and insults at work, and they can be widely accepted by the general populace for their identity. They seem to be at much less risk of violence and persecution too compared to real life. People also seem supportive of same-gender couples in general by matching two people of the same gender or expressing excitement over two queer people's budding relationship. However, queer people may still face the pressure to conform to heteronormative rules in their relationships and might receive snide remarks from others, although they can probably defend themselves much more easily as well. And of course, these effects can be worse for people who lack sufficient privilege to break free from heteronormative expectations. I think that if you're a Teyvat citizen who isn't cishet, you'll probably still have to go through the whole process of coming out of the closet and informing other people of your gender and or sexual identity. It may be easier than in real life, but still burdensome and intimidating too, especially when you have to constantly guess whether the person or group of people you're coming out to will be accepting or not. Not everyone in Teyvat will automatically be accepting unconditionally, but at least there may be a larger percentage of people in society that will be understanding of queer folks compared to the real world. of course, this is just one assessment of the situation, so if you do have some other ideas about the extent and limits of queerphobia in Teyvat, do feel free to leave a comment for my other viewers. If you do like this kind of content, do consider checking out my other videos, and I hope you have a good day.